This hour on I-24 News, Great Britain's Foreign Secretary is intensifying the dispute with Russia over the poisoning of a former double agent. Boris Johnson says that Russian President Putin likely ordered the attack.
Indeed, it was not long ago that Vladimir Putin was himself on television in Moscow announcing that such people should be poisoned.
Plus, 2 people were killed after a Palestinian man deliberately drove his car into a group of soldiers in the West Bank.
And investigators in Miami, Florida say crews were tightening the cables as part of a stress test when that pedestrian bridge collapsed. 6 people were killed.
From the I-24 News studios in Times Square in New York, this is Crossroads with David Schuster and Tal Heinrich.
Tensions continue to escalate between Great Britain and Russia. A leading member of the British government says it is overwhelmingly likely that Russian President Putin personally gave the order to poison a former double agent and his daughter.
British Foreign Secretary Boris Johnson directly accused Putin of approving the nerve agent attack and said the assassination attempt was outrageous.
It is overwhelmingly clear that this was directed by Russia, and we await a serious response from the Russians to that global condemnation. We have nothing against the Russians themselves. There is to be no Russophobia as a result of what is happening. Our quarrel is with Putin's Kremlin and with his decision, and we think it overwhelmingly likely that it was his decision to direct the use of a nerve agent on the streets of the UK, on the streets of Europe, for the first time since the Second World War. That is why we're at odds with Russia.
Russia has denied having any involvement and described Britain's accusations as propaganda and unforgivable.
However, with at least one report that the nerve agent was placed in Yulia Skripal's luggage in Russia before she traveled to England, Russian authorities announced their own criminal investigation. Meanwhile, Russia's ambassador to Great Britain is lashing out at the British government's expulsion of 23 Russian diplomats and what he called the UK's rush to judgment.
If the British side doesn't fulfill its obligations according to the convention, then this will, once again, demonstrate the travesty of the international law. The same way they did in Libya, in Iraq, and other places, this is not new to us. But nevertheless, this is quite a serious conversation, a professional conversation. And we will, of course, exert maximum pressure on British government over this matter.
Let's bring in our I-24 News UK and European correspondent Jonathan Sarchidoti. And Jonathan, Boris Johnson has a habit sometimes of speaking a little bit, going a little bit further than British Prime Minister Theresa May. Is that what happened on this day, or is this the essential plan by the British government to intensify the rhetoric?
Well, initially, remember, the Prime Minister, Theresa May, said that it was highly likely Russia was responsible. Then yesterday, the UK's Defence Secretary, Gavin Williamson, said that Russia should go away and shut up. And today, Boris Johnson, the Foreign Secretary, said it was overwhelmingly likely and then pointed the finger directly at Vladimir Putin. So you can see that there has been something of an escalation in the language that Britain has been using, if only in a subtle way. Whether or not it's official or not, we can't know. The Foreign Office and the Prime Minister's office were asked, but they haven't really commented on whether Boris Johnson's language was intentionally ratcheting up those tensions. In the meantime, as you said, the Kremlin has strongly denied all of this, and they call out Britain for using this increasingly inflammatory language.
Boris Johnson is probably the man of the hour today in the UK, but I'm wondering if there are calls in the UK to back up his words with actions against President Putin, and not only against his circle. But to a different development now, Jonathan, a new theory has emerged that the poison might have been planted in the suitcase of Sergei Skripal's daughter just before she left Moscow. How does that work? What are the implications?
Well, the implications are interesting because during the course of this investigation, they haven't really revealed an awful lot about how they believe the poison was actually administered. There have been lots of people second-guessing and various different sources briefing people as to what might have happened. It's gone from the possibility that they were poisoned in Mr. Skripal's house, to in his car, to in the restaurant where they sat. But now this latest report in the Telegraph newspaper says that possibly Yulia Skripal brought the poison over in her own suitcase, perhaps impregnated into her clothing or a present, something which might have then been opened or touched at some point during that journey that the Skripals took. And that would mean that there may not actually be a suspect seen in these CCTV images that we can see now. There may not have been a suspect who police can find and look for as a direct assailant, let's say, somebody who administered the poison. If she did it herself and the poison was put in her bag in Russia, that could make the job of proving a direct link all that much harder.
Jonathan, a man by the name of Nikolai Glushkov was found dead in Great Britain this week as well, and now his death is also being investigated as a murder case?
Yes, Nikolai Glushkov was found dead in his home, and he was, of course, found dead in New Malden. It's understood that his daughter found him there. He was a prominent Kremlin critic who was the director of the Russian airline Aeroflot during the 1990s. In 1999, he was charged with money laundering and fraud and spent 5 years in jail. He then fled to the UK in 2004, and in 2010 was granted political asylum here. Last year, a Russian court sentenced him to 8 years in his absence when reviewing his case, and he's since been listed by Russia as a person wanted for serious crimes. So when he was found in that house with compression to the neck being the cause of death, there were, of course, suspicions that there may be Russian involvement. At the very least, the police are saying it's being treated as a murder investigation.
All right, 24 News UK and European correspondent Jonathan Sarchidoti. Jonathan, thank you. Tal, what do you make of the increased rhetoric between the UK and Russia?
First, there's so much drama with these new developments. What Jonathan just told us, that it might have been in her suitcase. It's crazy. I'm just wondering how these accusations between the two countries right now and the wretched up of rhetoric is infecting maybe the Russia elections on Sunday.
Or whether that was perhaps part of it, but maybe this is an effort by Great Britain to use this as an excuse to try to embarrass Vladimir Putin and bring down perhaps the numbers that he might have, although I'm not so sure that the Russian voters would necessarily care, but it does come at a fascinating time.
Yeah, I'm also wondering if the Russians were somewhat surprised by the very, very harsh, fierce response by not only the UK, but also UK allies like the United States.
Indeed. Indeed.
Well, turning now to the Middle East, 2 Israeli soldiers were killed and 3 more were injured in a car ramming attack Friday afternoon in the northern West Bank. The
Palestinian driver is in police custody and is being questioned. Officials say that he deliberately ran over soldiers patrolling an area near a settlement. Defense correspondent Daniel Tzemach has more.
Early Friday evening, outside of the Jewish settlement of Mavodotan, a Palestinian driver accelerated and hit a group of IDF soldiers. 4 soldiers were hit. 2 of them were killed. 2 others were injured. One of those soldiers is in very serious condition. The second has been moderately injured. That Palestinian who perpetrated the attack is from the nearby village of Jenin. Was actually arrested in the past by the Israeli security agency. This comes on the heels of a day of rage called for by Hamas in regards to the 100 days since Trump's announcement regarding Jerusalem as Israel's capital. As a result, they have praised the attack through a Hamas spokesman who said that this attack is indeed evidence that the Palestinian Intifada is continuing. The attack was also supported by the Palestinian Islamic Jihad. As a result of the day of rage and as a result of this incident, the IDF security presence has increased throughout the entire West Bank and is likely to be on high alert for the days to come. Daniel Tzemach, I-24 News, the West Bank.
The U.S. Pentagon has confirmed that a military helicopter crashed in western Iraq, killing all 7 U.S. service members who were on board.
The aircraft went down near the border with Syria. Coalition forces say the crash was not a result of enemy fire, but may have been caused by a technical malfunction.
This type of helicopter is typically flown by the United States Air Force for medical evacuations. President Trump offered his condolences in a post on Twitter. The incident is under investigation. Still ahead, Lebanon's military has announced plans to add more forces along the border with Israel. We'll take a look at the possible implications and fallout.
Plus, new reports that Yemen's Houthi rebels and Saudi Arabia are reportedly in secret talks to end the war in Yemen. The The Israeli-Lebanon border has been relatively quiet for over 10 years now, but Lebanon is now reportedly beefing up its military presence.
Lebanese Prime Minister Saad Hariri told officials in Rome that he plans to add more Lebanese soldiers and equipment along the Israeli border in response to Israel's construction of a wall. Emily Rose has more.
Lebanon's beefing up its forces facing Israel.
We will be sending more LAF troops to the south, and we stress our intention to deploy a model regiment.
Despite tensions on the Syrian border, Iran's rising influence, and other conflicts shaking the region, Hariri was very clear which country he regarded as the real enemy.
Israel remains the primary threat to Lebanon. Its daily violation to our sovereignty must stop. While we are thinking of ways to move from a state of cessation of hostilities to a state of permanent ceasefire, Israel continues to make plans to build walls on reservation areas along the Blue Line.
Some Israeli defense officials think a stronger national Lebanese military could weaken the country's powerful Iran-backed Hezbollah. Still, as Hezbollah integrates into mainstream Lebanese politics, some also fear a powerful Lebanese military could pose a threat to Israel, as the lines between Hezbollah and the Lebanese military may blur. But the group made it clear Thursday it does not see war on the horizon.
I clearly express the view of Hezbollah that it is ready to confront the aggression if it happens, if Israel decides to carry out any foolish action, but it does not appear that the circumstances are for an Israeli decision for war.
But tensions between the two countries remain high. Israel and Lebanon are also in a dispute over an area of sea, which is believed to contain natural gas that each side claims for itself. Only time will tell if the two are headed for a conflict or a continued state of cold, quiet, tense relations. Emily Rose, I-24 News.
Meanwhile, the head of the United Nations is warning Lebanon to stop meddling in Syria.
Antonio Guterres directed his comments specifically at the Iranian-backed group Hezbollah, which has a major role in Lebanon. Guterres said he was concerned about the unauthorized weapons in the hands of Hezbollah. Thousands of Hezbollah fighters have been sent to Syria to fight alongside Syrian President Bashar al-Assad's army, including most recently in eastern Ghouta. And turning to another conflict area in the Middle East, there are reports that Saudi Arabia and Iranian-backed Houthi rebels are holding secret talks to try to end a 3-year-old war in Yemen. Two diplomats said the Houthi spokesman had been in direct communications with Saudi officials in Oman on a comprehensive solution to the conflict. Houthi rebels, backed by Iran, seized control of the capital Sana'a in 2014 and forced Yemen's president into exile. More than 10,000 civilians have died since the start of the conflict. The fighting has also sparked one of the worst humanitarian crises on the planet. More than 8 million people face a food crisis in Yemen. To discuss, we're joined here by Thane Rosenbaum, a Middle East analyst. Thane, these are good news if there is really negotiations going on to end the war in Yemen. It's not good news, I'm guessing, if you're Iran. It's not one of your interests. But to what extent do you think the increased international pressure on Saudi Arabia has to do with it?
Well, I think that everybody's trying to detach Iran's destabilizing influence in the region, and we see that everywhere. We see that in Lebanon, of course, with Hezbollah, and in Syria, their ongoing meddling in the Syrian war, and also in Yemen. And, you know, the Saudis have their own incentive here. They've been dragged into the Yemenite civil war. President Hadi is basically in exile in Saudi Arabia. He's not even a part of these discussions, just to show you how involved Saudi Arabia is alone. But I think the main reason is for the same reason Israel cares about the nuclear deal. I mean, in the end, it's yes, there's a humanitarian crisis, but it's really to detach this destabilizing influence and this kind of Shiite axis of terror that you're seeing in 3 different countries. And Saudi Arabia wants Iran out, and the only way out of Yemen is to get rid of the Houthis.
Do the Houthis have enough autonomy from Iran, though, to strike some sort of deal with Saudi Arabia?
That's the part I don't even understand, right? I don't even understand what the Houthis' incentive here is, because to some degree, you know, they're really almost a shadow puppet government that's operating in Yemen, working for the Iranians. So why they're engaged in this, I don't know, unless they're taking a break. You know,
and they're even denying the fact that they're getting help from Iran.
Right. Well, again, that's the idea that, we have nothing to do with Iran. Meanwhile, we couldn't exist without Iran. And, some of these times, one of the things that we've learned about Iran is they're extremely cagey in everything they do. They're very sophisticated. They blow up things, and they don't do it in the way ISIS does. They do it in a very subtle, more nuanced way. So this, to me, might be a way for them to speak to sort of taking a break. I certainly don't think this is a sign that the Houthis are in any way disconnecting themselves from Iran. They don't have an existence outside of Iran.
Thane, going back to Israel and Lebanon's border, it's been a while now that we've seen the enhanced rhetoric between the two sides, but it usually between Israel and Hezbollah. And now Hassan Nasrallah, leader of Hezbollah, he could be pretty satisfied that even Prime Minister Hariri is ratcheting up this rhetoric. How dangerous, how significant is it for Israel?
Another thing, Tal, odd, right? Like, why would he have tough talk on Israel? He actually knows, aside from what your segment talked about, this dispute about oil, but aside from that, the Lebanese have nothing to worry about with Israel. The only time Israel's ever interested in Lebanon is when they harbor terrorists. They did this with the PLO in the 1970s and 1980s, and now Hezbollah is a Shiite-backed, essentially controlling all of Lebanon. I think this is a good sign in a way, because anything that strengthens Hariri's hand, anything that gives him, I would like for his military to be a serious military and to expunge, to expel, Nasrallah. The tough talk seems to be directed against Israel, but is there really a concern? The only reason Israel is concerned with Lebanon is Hezbollah. They have no other interest.
Is there another angle of domestic politics in Lebanon that may be at play here? That is, maybe Hariri is doing this symbolically to try to keep Hezbollah at bay and to say, look, of course, I'm concerned about Israel, and you're moving troops closer to Israel and Syria. I'm going to move them closer to the Lebanese border, even though he may have no intention of ever following through on whatever Hezbollah may be up to.
And, David, we've seen this. The Arab street responds to point to Israel. Everyone, if you point to Israel, you might have some other intentions, but even when you're doing something that's diplomatically is in Israel's interests, we see this with Sisi in Egypt all the time. Great ally, but on the Arab street, Sisi doesn't sound like a lover of Israel, but he's become diplomatically engaged with them. So you're quite right. It might be just a ploy to send a message to Nasrallah and to Hezbollah. I'm back in business. Yes, I was exiled for a while. I mean, remember, he resigned, curiously, in November. He was sitting in Saudi Arabia. He resigned. No one knew why. Then he said, forget it. I can't change my mind. I want us to come back. He came back. Maybe this is his way of sending a subtle message, but doing it indirectly by saying, I'm really here to fight Israel. But he knows there's nothing to fight with Israel. Israel and he have one thing in common: get rid of Nasrallah and Hezbollah.
But speaking of sending a message, as we saw in this segment, a spokesperson of Hezbollah said, we're not expecting a war with Israel, but we are ready for one. Are they? Because they've been engaged in fighting in Syria, helping President Assad. They lost a lot of fighters. But what are their capabilities right now and the equipment that they have? How deadly will be the next round?
Well, that always has to do with Iran, right? I mean, everything, the strength that Hezbollah has is only through Iranian rockets. Israel is not concerned about anything other than, it's not the 1,500 fighters that they sent to Syria. They can come back and the Israelis will take care of them. It's really the weapons. It's the ballistic missiles, which is why when you see Hariri saying, well, we see these very dangerous Israeli maneuvers over our airspace and sovereignty. Again, they're only interested, Israel's interest is destroying weapons that have been moving through Syria into Lebanon. That's its only purpose. So I don't think that they're a threat to Israel other than how many weapons actually get through Syria and land in Lebanon and are ultimately used by Nasrallah. But I think you're quite right. I don't think he's ready to go to war. I think he's got his own problems in Syria, which again are problems that he had to inherit because Iran directed him in that way.
Thane Rosenbaum, thank you.
Thank you.
In Syria, Turkish forces shelled the city of Afrin overnight, killing at least 18 people.
Plus, there's some new details on a plan by U.S. Ambassador to the UN, Nikki Haley, to punish countries who do not support the wishes of the United States. In Syria, thousands of civilians are trying to escape the city of Afrin following a major attack overnight by Turkey. At least 18 people were killed. Turkish forces claim that they are close to capturing the city from U.S.-backed Kurdish fighters. The Kurds have controlled Afrin since the early days of the Syrian civil war.
Turkey considers the Kurds to be terrorists. The U.S. has called on Turkey to end its offensive, but Turkey has rejected those calls. The UN is warning about another humanitarian disaster.
Hundreds of thousands of civilians are at risk, including those recently displaced from other areas captured by Turkish-led forces. We have received reports that only those civilians who have contacts within the Kurdish Authority or the Kurdish armed forces have been able to leave. But even they have to make a treacherous path through, risking shelling and explosive hazards only to reach checkpoints manned by government-backed armed groups, where they may only be permitted to cross after paying a bribe.
Meantime, in another part of Syria, the army says they have recaptured 70% of the territory in eastern Ghouta.
Thousands of civilians fled the besieged Syrian rebel enclave in what is believed to be one of the largest exoduses in one day in the country's 7-year war. Also on this day, Russia responded to a warning that the United States would take action in Syria if Russia and the United Nations failed to end the fighting in Ghouta.
Earlier, the United States had threatened to conduct a military strike on Syrian territory, including Damascus, similar to the attack in April last year, which the U.S. had conducted with the excuse of the Syrian government's use of a chemical weapon. It's unacceptable, and we have clearly conveyed that to the U.S. side through diplomatic and military channels.
Officials from Turkey and Iran attending that meeting with Lavrov agreed to hold a summit on Syria in the near future. Meantime, a 9th round of Syria peace talks will be held in Astana in mid-May.
Not holding my breath.
But who's counting?
Right.
Yeah.
At the United Nations, U.S. Ambassador Nikki Haley is making good on a threat that she made earlier this year.
Haley is planning to cut off aid to any countries that don't back or vote against the United States. Our international affairs correspondent Bianca Zanini has the story.
U.S. President Donald Trump is watching who's got his back and promising to punish those who don't. In an internal memo reviewed by Foreign Policy magazine, the message is clear. U.S. Ambassador to the UN Nikki Haley is echoing the president, suggesting making foreign aid conditional on political support. The U.S. will not give money to programs or countries that provide little or no return on investment. One of the main things the Trump administration is asking for, support for U.S. positions at the UN. Already back in December, Trump threatened to cut foreign aid to any country voting against the U.S. in a UN resolution criticizing his decision to declare Jerusalem the capital of Israel.
And we give them hundreds of millions of dollars in aid and support, tremendous numbers that nobody understands. That money is on the table, and that money is not going to them.
And he kept his word. He cut tens of millions of dollars in aid to the UN Agency for Palestinian Refugees. The new memo suggests a review of almost 40 countries which receive millions of dollars in American aid while voting against the U.S. 54% of the time.
For those that don't have our back, we're taking names. We will make points to respond to that accordingly.
Some of the largest recipients of U.S. aid include Egypt and Iraq, which votes against the U.S. 60% of the time, but they're unlikely to be targeted. The memo cites issues of national security and economic needs. Instead, it's mostly development programs like education and infrastructure in countries such as Zimbabwe, Ghana, and Vietnam. The view that aid money should come with political demands is dividing the waters both in and outside the U.S. For Israel, this move could mean more support in the Security Council and potentially a decrease in overall criticism by the UN. As the U.S. takes names, Israel is crossing its fingers.
Thank you very much.
Bianca Zanini, I-24 News.
Zimbabwe, Vietnam, Ghana, are these the countries that the United States should be really putting its thumb on the back of?
I'm not sure.
Yeah, I mean, Zimbabwe just had a political change, right? Mugabe is gone, so maybe there's a new opportunity with them, but it feels like it feels small.
Speaking of political changes, David, so many changes in the West Wing, and Nikki Haley seems to be very, very stable in her seat.
Yeah, I mean, there was all this talk at AIPAC, of course, that she's, I mean, look, she's a rock star on the issues of the Middle East. And clearly she's beloved by President Trump, who likes having somebody at the United Nations who can stick it to the UN and make these kind of threats.
But do you think that at a certain point the president might be threatened by Nikki Haley?
That is a great question, especially because of so much talk about her as a possible presidential candidate. And so maybe for Nikki Haley, she does have to play this, carefully. She can't disagree with President Trump on clear, obvious policy issues. There was a little bit of disagreement when she talked about issues with sexual harassment and sexual assault, and the president apparently was mad about that. But I think it's a great point that makes it for her. She has to be very careful. Very careful not to ruffle
She probably knows
feathers.
that. She probably knows that. I mean, she's getting a lot of attention also here by U.S. media. I mean, do you remember anyone in this role getting as much attention as Nikki Haley?
No. And the idea that somebody from South Carolina would be so well versed on foreign policy is also striking a lot of at least Democrats as somewhat surprising.
Well, and people outside the U.S. are also paying attention to.
By the way, just ahead, we're going to get an update on the situation in Miami, where investigators are still sifting through the rubble of a collapsed bridge to recover more victims. Meanwhile, the company responsible for the structure is facing new questions. Night 24 News continues after.
Welcome back to Crossroads. Search and rescue teams are carefully unearthing bodies and vehicles from under the concrete bridge that collapsed suddenly in Miami on Thursday afternoon.
Officials say the bridge's internal support cables were being tightened just as the bridge crumbled onto traffic below, crushing 8 cars under 950 tons of concrete and steel. Correspondent Maggie Ruley has the latest.
It's unbelievable.
A community still in shock after a bridge meant to keep students safe comes crashing down. At least one student among the dead.
Someone has to be held accountable for this situation because this is completely and utterly unacceptable.
Crews are now working on a mission of recovery.
We've determined that there's no longer any survivors. That's why we transitioned into this recovery mode.
And investigation.
Our entire purpose for being here is to find out what happened.
The bridge went up just a few days ago and was built in a matter of hours using accelerated bridge construction, meaning it's built ahead of time like this one on the side of the road and then moved into place all in a few hours.
It could be a design flaw. It could be a flaw in the construction staging. It could be the actual construction materials or the equipment itself. There are so many things you have to look at to come up with a final reason why.
Last night, the city of Sweetwater confirmed they conducted a stress test on the bridge Thursday morning. And Florida Senator Marco Rubio tweeted that the bridge collapsed after the engineering firm ordered to have the cables tightened. But today,
we have not confirmed that there was a stress test.
The contractor and bridge architect have pledged to fully cooperate with the investigation.
And correspondent Maggie Ruley joins us now live at the site of that collapse in Miami. Maggie, are investigators any closer to finding out how this happened?
Well, they certainly are trying to find out just that. We've heard from authorities, both the state senator here as well as the governor and the chief of police, saying they are going to find out exactly what happened, find out who's responsible, and hold them accountable. But there are still so many questions. We just heard some of them. We heard, was there a stress test that was happening? That is one of the main questions that's being asked right now. But there are so many things that they have to look at. They have to look at the construction materials. They have to look at the design. Was there a flaw, or was it a perfect design? Was that design inspected properly? And lastly, how was it constructed? Is the method of construction potentially to blame? So they have their plates full right now. The NTSB is on the scene currently. They've been here since last night. We're told they'll be here for at least 5 to 7 more days working on this, trying to figure out first what went wrong and then if someone needs to be held responsible.
Maggie, you would think that by now people would certainly know whether or not there was a stress test being conducted, unless people are not talking to the investigators because of any sort of legal reasons. Is that perhaps slowing some of this down?
You know, it's a really good question. We're not sure. As we just talked about, at first, authorities said there was a stress test that happened Thursday morning. Marco Rubio even tweeting out that the bridge collapsed as that stress test was happening and they were tightening the cables. But today, we heard from the mayor. He said, we're not confirming that a stress test ever happened. And when he was pushed by reporters, he kept saying that line again and again. No, we are not going to confirm it. Now, the reason this is such a sensitive issue is because this is a major highway right here in the state of Florida, and it was left open during this potential stress test. So Now that we know that was there or was there not a stress test happening, the question is, if there was, why was this highway left open? So that is why there is so much sensitivity around this. Was there, wasn't there? And that's what investigators are going to have to get to the heart of.
And Maggie, we heard in your report that the bridge was installed using what is known as accelerated bridge construction. How common is this technique?
It's actually a fairly common technique. While it's relatively new, since 2010, more than 800 bridges have been installed using this technology. Now, it's supposed to be safer, actually. It's supposed to be safer not only for construction crews, but for pedestrians, for cars, and it's supposed to allow highways like this one to remain open as they're installing it. And now, what they'll often do is they'll build a piece of the bridge like this one, a massive piece of bridge. They'll build it somewhere off-site, then they'll bring it to where the location of where it's going to be installed. They'll position it next to the highway, and then in just a matter of hours, they'll rotate it 90 degrees so that it sits over the highway. And that's exactly what happened here just a few days ago on Saturday. This entire hunk of bridge, nearly 1,000 tons, was lifted and rotated in just a matter of hours.
Maggie Rulli reporting from Miami. Maggie, thank you. We appreciate the report. There is every indication that President Trump's National Security Advisor H.R. McMaster's days may be numbered and that he is about to be fired from the White House.
The Washington Post reports that President Trump wants to let McMaster go, but the president wants to wait until he can find a suitable replacement and so that the general is not humiliated. White House press secretary denied that there were any changes in the works.
The Chief of Staff actually spoke to a number of staff this morning, reassuring them that there were personnel changes, no immediate personnel changes at this time, and that people shouldn't be concerned. We should do exactly what we do every day, and that's come to work and do the very best job that we can.
Let's bring in Washington correspondent Mike Vaquera. And Mike, she said no immediate changes at this time.
Personal changes at this time.
I mean, that leaves a lot of room there, right?
Well, I mean, judging from what's happened to the Trump administration over the last 14 months, those are not really reassuring words if there are reports throughout the media that your job is on the line and you're going to be gone within a matter of days. I think you or Tal just said H.R. McMaster, the National Security Advisor's days are numbered. But the only question is how many days are in that number. Remember, it was Rex Tillerson who was hung out to dry in limbo. Similar leaks had him out the door sometime before the holidays, before the new year, and he lasted until last weekend. And a President Trump tweet that informed Rex Tillerson, just fresh off a trip to Africa in his capacity of Secretary of State, that he was gone. So H.R. McMaster and President Trump reports over the course of the last several months have said that they simply do not click. That McMaster, what's more, does not get along with the Chief of Staff, John Kelly, which is interesting considering they are both generals. McMaster, an active duty general in the United States military. But one of the fundamental ironies of the Trump administration and this West Wing is even though it leaks like crazy that there is backstabbing and finger pointing to members of the press, that John Kelly himself today, in what was supposed to be an off-the-record briefing, but was reported on by the outfit called Axios, told reporters that President Trump himself is sort of to blame for this because he calls his friends, he calls people all over town, he sort of thinks out loud, and then reporters call those friends, and that's the origin of some of these stories. But the irony is that though this White House leaks, no one ever knows what the real story is because it's all in President Trump's mind, and he changes his mind from day to day, sometimes from minute to minute, depending on what the media is saying and what's on television, some of his more favorite programs. So it's a typical Friday evening here in Washington, waiting to see what the West Wing is going to do, what announcements are going to come either via Twitter or via leak. But that's where we are at this moment, David.
So the president hasn't fired anyone yet today. Yeah. Meantime, in the Russian meddling investigation, Mike, Mueller has subpoenaed the Trump organization for business documents. The president has said in the past that this kind of inquiry into his finances is some sort of a red line. What does it mean?
Red line. Well, we're going to find out what that means. One thing we can be relatively certain of, given all the uncertainties that are surrounding this investigation and all the uncertainties that are surrounding what's happening inside the West Wing, is that Bob Mueller is not the sort of individual who has demonstrated time and time again that he really is concerned about another person's red line, that he has this mandate as the special counsel to take the investigation wherever it may lead and pursue illegal activity. And, of course, we saw the same in a previous special counsel investigation led by Ken Starr into the Clinton administration. So they can reach far afield. The president obviously very sensitive about the Trump organization, whether and how far this goes, what kind of records have been subpoenaed from his organization. The president obviously had, for example, promised to release, during the campaign, release his tax returns. We all know he has not done so. And whether or not Bob Mueller, in doing so, in subpoenaing these records from the Trump organization, is pursuing something that has to do with the organization's ties to Russia. Something that the president has said in the past, that he has no business ties with Russia, something that has obviously been disputed time and again, Tom.
Veteran Washington, D.C. reporter Mike Vaccaro reporting tonight for us. Mike, thanks so much. We appreciate it.
Okay.
And speaking of Russia, Russia heads to the polls this weekend. We take a look back at the unique connection between former U.S. President George W. Bush and President Vladimir Putin and see how the relationship between Russia and the United States has changed since then.
Plus, is Israel ready for a tsunami? You know, like a meteor hitting the Mediterranean and giant waves crashing up on the Holy Land? We'll get an answer from Elan Levy ahead. Russian President Vladimir Putin has held on to power in Moscow for almost 20 years, and it looks like he is set to remain there.
He has had a long and complicated relationship with 3 U.S. presidents, beginning with George W. Bush.
Our own Nina Larson takes a closer look.
The 2 new presidents would seem to have little in common. The son of a former U.S. president and a former KGB agent. But one day changed everything. Both found themselves on the same side in the war on terror. Russia choosing to support the U.S. and NATO in Afghanistan. Putin facing his own terror front in Chechnya.
I was able to get a sense of his soul.
But old tensions resurface over Iraq. Putin standing with France against the war. Tensions also over pro-American Russian neighbours Georgia and Ukraine, which remain today. A new president for the US, a new vision at odds with Moscow.
I state clearly and with conviction America's commitment to seek the peace and security of a world without nuclear weapons.
Putin objects to an inherited missile defense system right on Russia's border. Nevertheless, the Obama administration pushes for a reset.
We were in the thick of the war in Afghanistan, and we were having real problems with Pakistan. We needed them, on the one hand, to not scuttle us on other foreign policy objectives, and we needed them in Afghanistan to literally let us move supplies.
Putin takes a temporary back seat to stand in Dmitry Medvedev and returns more of a strongman than ever, keeping a tight rein on democracy and filling the Syrian power vacuum.
Ultimately, he's a very proud Russian who feels that Russia has suffered greatly in its fall from Soviet times and the period of weakness of the Yeltsin years. He also resented what the United States did on the world stage. He has made a particular objective to restore Russian greatness and restore Russia's prerogatives, especially in the broader Middle East and Eastern Europe, and to weaken the United States.
Newly elected President Trump seemed enchanted with his counterpart.
I believe that he feels that he and Russia did not meddle in the election.
A stance he's starting to regret.
They have treated the use of a military-grade nerve agent in Europe with sarcasm, contempt and defiance.
It looks like it. I spoke with the Prime Minister and we are in deep discussions, a very sad situation. It certainly looks like the Russians were behind it.
But has the Trump administration completely underestimated Putin's endgame?
He has figured out, like most people have figured out, the way to Trump's heart, and he has sown real division within the alliance, within NATO, within the Western allies. Think about it, just this week, the ambassador to the United Nations, Nikki Haley, she says we stand with our British partners, and that's breaking news.
Bush. Senior diplomatic correspondent Nina Larson joins us now to discuss all of this. So as this expert over there said, Putin has figured out a way into Trump's heart. But on the other hand, George W. Bush had a sense of his soul, Putin's soul. Interesting. We couldn't stop laughing while we heard the soundbite.
Never gets old. Even
never gets old. Never gets old. So elections in Russia. on Sunday. Let's start from the end. Let's start with the results. Can we do that?
I think it's pretty much a no-brainer that he will actually win again, and this could put him in power for another 6 years. He is 65 at the moment, but he has no sign of letting go at all, and he's very, very popular in Russia at the moment. The latest polls show he's at 69%.
What sort of platform, if any, has he been running on?
Basically, David, make Russia great again. And a lot of people have bought into this narrative. There's a tremendous nostalgia for the old Soviet Union still in Russia, and he really symbolizes this. I mean, we saw him a couple of weeks ago in the equivalent of the Russian State of the Union displaying this very sophisticated new missile technology he says that Russia has that can obliterate Florida. And that's another part of the narrative, portraying the US as some kind of enemy. I mean, he is very popular. The economy isn't doing that well at the moment. It's been impacted by the US and EU sanctions after Russia invaded the Crimea. But, you know, he's still doing pretty well.
I'm wondering, is he still popular given all the tremendous international pressure from the U.S. and also from the U.K. right now with the latest poisoning scandal? How does it all play in the vote on Sunday?
Well, the elections will be viewed in a harsher light overseas, but domestically, I don't think this will impact him at all. If anything, it makes him look more invincible.
You think there's any possibility that some of the reason that Great Britain and even the United States to a certain extent have ratcheted up the rhetoric against Vladimir Putin is because of these elections, that this is some sort of effort to say to the Russian electorate, look, your guy is controversial, and maybe if they can bring the numbers down even just a little bit, that somehow embarrasses him?
Possibly, but I think current events have spoken for themselves. I mean, this spy scandal and this poisoning, this is the first time a chemical weapons agent of this grade has been used in a NATO country. This is a very, very big deal. And we're seeing it played out on the world stage. We'll see some UN action possibly about this. And Russia has broken international law. So they've brought it on themselves.
And the timing is also another factor here, right before the elections. They couldn't have found a worse timing.
Yeah, why not wait until after the elections or wait until the summertime and then do your little poisoning thing or do the nuclear reactor plutonium poisoning they did with Litvinenko many years ago?
I think because he thinks he can get away with it.
Remarkable.
A fourth term.
Right.
He's still
so
there.
The results come in. I assume they're counted pretty quickly. We'll know Monday,
We should know Monday morning, yes.
And then does he have some sort of inauguration or some sort of ceremony to celebrate his victory?
I think he would, yeah.
For the fourth time.
Yes.
Wow. All right, Nina Larson, our senior diplomatic correspondent. Nina, thank you. We appreciate it. Still ahead, is Israel ready for a tsunami? You know, the kind with gigantic waves and meteors that hit the ocean and crash into land. That kind of tsunami. Is Israel ready? We'll get a closer look ahead.
Tsunamis in the Mediterranean are not a common occurrence.
But that is not stopping one country from preparing for the worst. Our Elon Levy has the story.
Could Tel Aviv be hit by a tsunami? It sounds unthinkable, but Israel believes it's a question of when, not if. All along the coast, these signs are warning people where to run in case a tsunami hits the coast. I-24 News set out to investigate.
It will happen. I don't know when, I don't know where. For certain, it will happen.
A tsunami in Israel is what's called a low-probability, high-impact event. Unlikely to happen in our lifetimes, but it'll be devastating when it does.
About every 700 years, we're going to have a large tsunami, and the last one was 800 years ago. But this is just statistic; it could happen any moment.
Israel is preparing for waves of up to 5 meters, which could flood Israel as far as 1 kilometer inland.
The height of the wave is not the big issue here. It's the length of the wave. Tsunami wave could reach to 100 kilometers, 150 kilometers. So, you know, it's like the whole sea raises and, you know, go on the coast.
According to the Israel Geological Survey, an extreme tsunami would flood the entire Tel Aviv beach together with all its seafront hotels. The Yarkon River would burst its banks, flooding the entire Tel Aviv port area. A whole chunk of South Tel Aviv would be flooded as well. The Sde Dov airport would be underwater, and so would Jaffa Port together with the I-24 News studios.
The water comes and comes and comes for 10, 15, 20 minutes. It's a huge amount of water.
Up north in Haifa, a tsunami could engulf the railway line along the coast and wash away cars on the coastal road. Haifa port would be submerged and the old city of Acre would be underwater.
The large waves could go on for 6 hours or even longer, every half hour or so. But even after the waves calm down, there would be powerful currents on the coast that could capsize boats. The whole thing easily lasts half a day or a whole day.
It turns out there's no chance of a Boxing Day-style mega tsunami engulfing the Mediterranean coast, but the damage could still be severe.
Israel would face a major hit to its national infrastructure, with large power plants, refineries and desalination plants right along the coast.
We're talking about billions of dollars. It will take us years to recover.
New facilities should be planned to withstand a tsunami and, if possible, moved away from the coast. There's no point building a school in an area that could be hit.
There are two main ways a tsunami could hit Israel's coast. One option is a powerful earthquake in the Aegean Sea or near Cyprus, and sirens would give Israelis up to 1 hour to flee.
We expect the population just to, run for their lives.
But a tsunami would be much more lethal if prompted by an earthquake in Israel.
An earthquake in the Jordan Valley would cause a major landslide on the seabed, which would provoke a tsunami.
The tsunami would strike immediately and could cause a humanitarian catastrophe, especially if the beaches were packed.
We have no warning at all. A tsunami will be very, very fast here, about 10 minutes.
The last tsunami was in 1956 and only 30 centimeters high. But scientists believe the biggest tsunami ever in the region was 9 meters.
Authorities are taking no chances, warning people to run to higher ground.
Israel is readier than we used to be, that's for sure. We're not there yet.
Thanks to Israel's volatile security situation, its people are used to running for shelter during times of emergency, and that preparedness could serve them well in case of a natural disaster. Elon Levy, I-24 News.
Terrific reporting by Elon. I was a little concerned with him walking around with that microphone in the water that he might set off some sort of shock.
Yeah.
That's kind of dangerous, that kind of report.
But I was thinking, David, he said in this report that a tsunami might happen once every 700 years, right?
Right.
So what will come first, an end to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, or a tsunami, or it will come together?
And as he said, the last one was in 1956, so I figure we're good for at least 600 some years, right?
Yeah, I guess so. But if there is a tsunami in Israel, I would definitely want Elon Levy by my side, because now...
I'm putting him on my speed dial. Say, okay, Elon, what do I do? And he'll write back and say, run like hell.
But if he has those shorts and this sweatshirt.
He owns a swimsuit. I'm sure he does. But it is proper attire to do a stand-up like this, a reporter stand-up wearing, like reporter attire as opposed to like you're going surfing. Good for Elon.
I totally agree. I've never laughed so badly talking about a disaster, but yes.
By the way, Elon is not in shorts. That's not the only rare sight that we're going to bring you this hour.
What else do we have?
Well, we've got some thunder and lightning Wednesday evening. This is in the sky in California. Look at these colors. It turned the sky purple, and scientists say that the phenomena is based on environmental conditions and that it is not uncommon for lightning to turn the sky a variety of colors. And if I remember correctly from a class that I took in college, part of this is due to sort of the dust particles, that if there's a lot of pollution in the atmosphere, that can cause the sky to turn these very interesting colors of purple and orange and whatnot. And then if it's lit up by lightning, then you have these spectacular images like we just saw.
What was your major?
I was a political science major. But I did take a class in meteorology, believe it or not.
I thought it was just purple over California for the LA Lakers.
Have you ever seen anything like that?
No, no. I mean, it makes me think about,
You've never been through a tornado or hurricane or anything like this?
Or tsunami.
So in Indiana, where I grew up, we had thunderstorms all the time, and we had our share of tornadoes, and we hear the sirens where we run down. And actually, when I was covering Hurricane Katrina, where there actually was a storm surge that was 26 feet high in Mississippi, where I was covering it, in the midst of all of that, there was also some lightning, and you'd think that it was lightning because the transformers would blow because of the water and the seawater and whatnot, and it would set off these huge sparks, and you'd see sometimes these wild colors that would go with it. But It was kind of frightening. Just saying.
Yeah, well, in other countries across the world, you can see the beautiful blue and green colors, right? I have some of my friends traveling to Iceland. And,
the Northern Lights.
Exactly. I'd take purple over green, but just me.
And over brown, for sure.
All right. And that does it for this hour of Crossroads.
Stay with us on I-24 News for much more. We'll be right back after this.